The 2010 Winter Olympics are due to open in Vancouver on February 12th. The Olympic flame reached Canada in late October. Many of its bearers have been Native Americans, the First Nations as they are known in Canada. It was a right they claimed in recognition of the fact that the Games are taking place on their land. In downtown Vancouver, a pavilion will be presenting these 4 First Nations to the world. Without their goodwill, the Games may not have come to Canada at all. A dispute over the ownership of land they claim in British Columbia dragged on for decades. The First Nations never considered giving up their rights to it. Then the Olympics organizers made an offer. Millions of Canadian dollars changed hands, so the world could see Games in the Olympic spirit and Native Americans in peace and prosperity. No such offers were made to the province's other 200-some First Nations. On the contrary, Chief Tim Manuel is locked in conflict with energy companies.
If the government and BC Hydro aren't willing to do this, then I guess it's going to be an act of war. We're going to go to war.
A growing Vancouver means a growing need for electric power. The giant transmission lines dating back to the 1960s have to be expanded to meet that need. But the legal owners of the land, the First Nations, were never asked.
We can shut this down. We will shut it down. If that's what it takes, we will shut it down. And Vancouver, you may not be without any lights, I'm sorry to say. But until that day comes where recognition and reconciliation and certainly shared decision-making and revenue sharing happen with the First Nations people, then we will take this very seriously.
Their community is about a 3-hour drive from Vancouver. British Columbia's highest court has recognized their claim to ownership of the land and entitled them to financial compensation. But still, they live in poverty. The electric utility BC Hydro has filed an appeal. Millions of dollars are tied up in the courts. The school children on the reservation start every day with a traditional ceremony. To the First Nations, preservation of their cultural identity is a question of self-preservation. It gives the children a sense of community, of belonging together. Chief Tim Manuel regularly takes part in the ceremony.
About the BC Hydro project at
the language and the tribal myths, legends, and rituals help to give the children pride in their heritage, even if many Native Americans live on the very margins of modern Canadian society.
I think half the town came out and they were all excited. I guess the government always talks about the strength of claim. To us, it's never been about strength of claim. We have names, we have legends, we have stories of these, we have markers in our territory that certainly were the boundaries that were understood between different nations. Of course, the government today wants you to draw a line on the map. Where is your boundary? There was an understanding that, that's the way the old people were. They shared these territories. They shared the resources.
It's more for the sake of future generations that Tim Manuel keeps up the struggle for his tribe's land, and less for the few $1 million it's worth. His people say the mountains, lakes, and rocks have a soul of their own, and they house the spirits of the ancestors. The high-tension power lines that cut through the forests and meadows damage more than the ground they stand on.
Like this.
Tim Manuel's son, Isaac, is just 2.5 years old.
Hang on to it.
His schooling will include hunting and a knowledge of traditional medicinal herbs.
Look at there.
Yeah.
Tim Manuel's wife, Leanne, is the daughter of a Squamish chief. Before they were married, she lived in Vancouver. The Squamish are another of the 4 First Nations on whose land the Winter Olympics will be held. Often, public image has been a major factor influencing the government's treatment of individual tribes. The Winter Olympics are a glaring example. The 4 tribes hosting the games, among them the Squamish, received gifts worth millions of dollars, while neighboring tribes, like Tim Manuel's Upper Nicola, had to fight for their land.
As a community, we are benefiting greatly financially through employment and other avenues as well because of the Olympics, because of this agreement that was sought between the governments and the 4 host First Nations communities. There is a stark contrast, and I didn't know that this contrast existed until I moved up here and came up here and became a part of this community and realized the vast differing struggles of a wealthy First Nation and a rural First Nation until I came up here and realized how privileged we are and how much we are benefiting.
It's frustrating. You're going to see more from First Nations all across this province and probably the country. More court cases, more protests, roadblocks, anything to raise this profile, because the people have had enough. The grassroots people have had enough. My people here, I'm holding them back.
The family is off to take part in a blockade. A major lumber company has begun felling timber on a mountain the First Nations hold sacred. The Native Americans have blocked access to it for several weeks.
As the old people have taught us, when you come to the sacred area like this, and if you've never been here, you're new to this place, you take a little bit of charcoal, you mark your face with it. Tupa, ancestors will see you, and if you don't mark yourself, you scare them away. They won't be here.
It's Leanne's first time here, so she marks her face. They reach the blockade. Canada's Supreme Court may have recognized the First Nations' rights to the land, but the provincial governments have yet to put the ruling into effect. They use various stalling tactics to draw things out. Many First Nations have in the meantime broken off negotiations with British Columbia.
Oh, okay. This area is very sacred to us. It's our church. We look at the mountain behind me here, Tehetkin. This was a mountain that was very spiritual. It was like my late father put it, the Vatican would be to the Catholics. This was to the Okanagan people, very sacred to us, and revered and respected, you know, something you would never desecrate.
The court is acutely aware that the stakes are high. Recognizing the Okanagan's claims based on tradition would set a precedent that could trigger an avalanche of similar lawsuits. But the Okanagans have a trump card. The high-tension power lines that supply Vancouver's electricity cross their land.
We'll stop this construction. We will certainly protest. We will use the Olympics as a venue to inform the international media that how the government's treating us. And like third-class citizens in our country, treating us as criminals, taking us to court for standing up for who we are and where we come from.
On the other side of the dispute is BC Hydro, a Crown corporation. At stake is a project that could bring in billions of dollars. It would not only supply power to the ever-growing Vancouver area, but south of the border to the USA as well, at a good price. Energy, Native Americans' rights, and billions in potential profits are also a major issue in the neighboring province of Alberta. Fort McMurray is a boomtown on top of the vast Athabasca oil sand deposits, with crude oil reserves second only to Saudi Arabia's in size. It may also be a vast environmental disaster in the making. The tailings are collected in large and toxic lakes, which must be continuously maintained. Even so, up to 11 million liters a day leak into the groundwater and rivers, endangering both people and the environment. The oil sands have made Canada one of the United States' biggest oil suppliers and one of the biggest producers of the greenhouse gas CO2. Canada has become a prime target of environmental activists worldwide The issue is a highly sensitive one, especially when the media are involved. The population of Fort McMurray has more than doubled in 10 years. Unskilled workers can earn up to 100,000 Canadian dollars a year, doing 12-hour shifts, 365 days a year. The climate is harsh, the work is hard, and alcohol and drug abuse are rampant. The most severe environmental damage is the least visible. An hour's flight due north, on the shores of Lake Athabasca, is the small town of Fort Chipewyan, on the traditional land of the Athabascan Chipewyan First Nation. In winter, temperatures can drop as low as minus 45 degrees. Sloan Whiteknife is one of the few in Fort Chipewyan who still live exclusively from hunting and trapping. His father, grandfather, and great-grandfather all lived from trading furs. In the late 1800s, Alberta signed treaties setting aside land for its First Nations, who often had little other choice and even less idea of what exactly they had agreed to. Even today, Canada interprets these treaties to mean the Native Americans ceded the rights to their land. Sometime around the late 1970s, snowmobiles replaced dog sleds. Sloan has seen many other things change as well, in both his society and the environment.
The trapping is not as good as long ago. Long ago, trapping was good, fur all over, and you can see not many tracks now, and it's been not too much fur lately, not like long ago. Okay, let's trap for marten now.
Sloan sets off to trap martens. They fetch up to $50 a pelt.
We've got a buck.
Animal populations are declining, but not because of overhunting. Too few people live on Canada's far northern plains to make that big a dent. But the edge of the oil sands is just over 100 kilometers away, and the Athabasca River flows north.
Cut through the water. There's not enough water, and that's why everything is going down. Even here, you see only a few rat houses. Long ago, it's full here, rat houses, right along the shore. There's a lot of water, and see how much water it is now? Not much water. There used to be water up to the banks of here.
Alberta's biggest lake is suffering a water shortage. Hot water is used to extract bitumen, or heavy crude oil, from the sand. Much of that water is taken from the Athabasca River, upwards of 480 million liters a day.
Can't do any fishing, can't drink that water. We still fish, but mostly for dogs, stuff like that. And even now, a lot of them they're afraid to eat or fish.
Fort Chipewyan has been in the news the past few years for the rising incidence of rare cancers among its residents. An official response has been slow in coming. Meanwhile, the billions in oil revenues grow ever faster. Alan Adam, chief of the Athabascan Chipewyans, and many others, see the oil sand extraction as the cause.
We're seeing rare diseases forming in the community, cancer diseases, lupus, severe arthritis, severe asthma. We're starting to notice that kids are starting to have severe skin rashes that are developing over the summer months when they start playing in the water and stuff like that. These are things that are not normal for us to be seeing around this area.
Billions more dollars are being invested in the oil sands industry. New production proposals are all but guaranteed permits from Alberta's provincial government.
All they've done is left a big environmental mess behind. Realistically, does it really make sense for them to continue on doing what they're doing if they can't even clean up their mess? And all we're saying is that clean up your mess, prove to us that you could do it in an environmental friendly way, before you continue on going ahead. If not, well, then shut the whole thing down and, till you prove otherwise, because our livelihood is at stake.
The government seems to have sided with industry in denying that the environment has sustained any real damage. The principal taker for oil from Alberta has so far been the USA. But as full-scale production in the Athabasca oil sands gets underway, the Canadians are looking for new markets in China. A 1,200-kilometer-long pipeline is in the planning.
What this map tells you, and really what we're talking about here, is we're talking about what is, without a doubt, the most complex pipeline project ever proposed for North America, I'd suggest. And it's complex for a lot of reasons. The geography is one of the features. It's going through mountain ranges in the northwest. It's going over mountain ranges around the BC-Alberta border, the development of oil sands in Alberta, and the introduction, not the introduction, but the expansion of shipping and tanker activity on the west coast. It's complex because it engages well over 50 different Aboriginal groups across the corridor. And they're not a stakeholder. They're much more than that, because as governments and as recognized under the Canadian Constitution, they have special rights that go beyond the rights of just what local municipal governments have or regional governments.
Roger Harris has just landed in Prince George to lobby one of the First Nations on behalf of Enbridge Pipelines Incorporated. He's got $100 million Canadian added incentive. But he faces the daunting task of having to convince all 50 First Nations to accept the pipeline. The ones in British Columbia have yet to sign a single land treaty with the Canadian government.
One of the comments that a First Nation will make is, as a unique nation, I should have the right for veto. I'd say notionally that may sound fair, but what happens if you actually have a project where 49 communities said yes and one said no? Are you not now actually disadvantaging or affecting the rights of 49?
Twice.
It's a somewhat transparent appeal to the First Nations sense of common cause. But Roger Harris's opposite number, David Luji, is well aware of the industry's billion-dollar game. He was the one who shot down the first attempt to get the First Nations to agree to the construction in 2006. Luji is the elected chief of the Carrier Sekani Tribal Council and a shrewd tactician who easily sees through all the industry's legal maneuvering. The proposal would take the pipeline across 450 kilometers of his First Nations land. But not all members of the tribe are opposed to it.
With Enbridge, for example, there's not unanimous agreement that we should oppose it. There's certain bands along the area who think that the project could do them well for the future. If you stay back away from it and don't accept any money, protocol money from the proponent, then you're in a much better position to say, number one, you haven't been consulted, and number two, you haven't definitely not been accommodated.
Enbridge is offering the First Nations an opportunity to buy a 10% stake in the pipeline. But he has no suggestions on how to come up with the financing.
So the whole discussion around Aboriginal rights and title will now become a component of this project.
It amounts to the First Nations becoming shareholders and risk takers in a private corporation in return for letting it use their land. Later, the industry representative admits that they have already resigned themselves to the prospect of paying $1 billion compensation to the First Nations. The next morning, David Luji surveys his tribe's land from the air. Among some of the First Nations, unemployment reaches 80%. David Luji points out that once construction of the pipeline is over in 3 or 4 years, the jobs for Native Americans will be over too. But the pipeline will remain, crossing over 700 rivers and creeks in their territory alone. The risk will also remain.
We're not against development. We're definitely for responsible development. Development that fits the social profiles of our territory, for example, the economic profiles, and planning for the future. you know, an oil spill happens around here or on the West Coast, that's going to destroy a lot of the values, the environmental values, the social trauma, the potential social trauma that's associated with the spill.
Gerald Amos is of the Haisla First Nation. For centuries, the Haisla have lived and fished in the fjords of Canada's Pacific coast. Amos puts out with a friend, Dan Paul, and his father. There are only 2 families left in the town of Kitimat who live from fishing. Even after 20 years, everyone here vividly remembers the Exxon Valdez oil spill. It contaminated vast stretches of the Alaskan coast. Soon, as many as 200 supertankers will be threading the maze of fjords to the pipeline terminal each year.
Some of the projects that are being talked about, such as Enbridge, the big one, I know there's almost total unity. If not unity, then agreement that this is the project that is probably the biggest threat to what's left of our culture and our way of life and our wealth.
He says the pipeline threatens the livelihoods of all the First Nations whose land it'll cross, and that means their identities as well. To get his message through, Gerald Amos has started organizing trips to the Athabasca oil sands.
The court cases that recently have recognized that, I think the judges have seen that in fact First Nations have not given up their jurisdiction, and that's what we're fighting for, is to have the government appreciate that they are dealing with a First Nation who has traditionally looked after their own interest. And in this instance, you know, with these big projects coming up, this is our interest right here, and this is what we're fighting for.
Canada's Supreme Court is granting the First Nations ever greater autonomy, but provincial governments aren't exactly helping them to exercise it. Gerald Amos has called an assembly of the First Nations affected by the pipeline in an attempt to forge a united front on the issue. Not easy with billions of dollars at stake. One evening a week, Haisla women teach young people traditional music and dance at the local gymnasium. It's another way to bring the community together and build cultural awareness. And it's a weapon against the alcohol and drug abuse and the sense of no purpose that often lies behind it. The representatives of nearly 50 First Nations are gathered in Kitimat. Gerald Amos has also brought attorneys up from Vancouver. They're up against powerful interests, Enbridge and the oil corporations. The chiefs also have to consider their own economic interests. Many tribes could well use an infusion of capital. But most of them doubt they would ever see much of the oil profits. Like so often in the past, they're afraid they'll be left with nothing but empty promises. After the assembly, Gerald Amos stops by a shopping mall in Kitimat. A totem pole is stored there in an empty hall. It's believed to have been carved by a Haisla named Gips Golox in the 1870s. In 1929, a Swedish consul brought the totem pole to Stockholm as a kind of trophy for a museum, but without asking the Haisla. Totem poles often stand for the history of a clan. They're meant to be put up in the community and allowed to decay. Gerald Amos brought it back from Sweden in 2006.
We went into the museum, and it was in the first time, I think, in some like 80 plus years that anybody from the Chais and the Chanaksia had physically seen this totem pole, right? So it was a pretty emotional moment. And one of the first visuals we had of it was it standing in the museum with what's behind you here, this sackle. And that's what was around the neck. Pretty damn symbolic, isn't it? And it was right here somewhere. I can't even describe the feeling that we got. Didn't know whether to be angry or to be happy or to. It was a mixture of everything, yeah? Because it's so symbolic of where our people have been, with the government policies and just industry coming in and raping the land at will almost. with the assistance of government, and this thing was around the neck. So when this totem pole came down and this was taken off, it was just such an emotional moment for, I think, anybody who's First Nations. It's out of jail now. So with the shackles off and it being taken from Sweden, we're back in control of it.
In the matter of the 2010 Winter Olympics, Canada and British Columbia have treated the First Nations as equal partners. In the matter of Alberta's oil sands and the pipeline to the Pacific, the First Nations have to fight for the same equal treatment.